I'm Ellie Lee. I'm one of the professors working at the University of Kent in our social sciences department. I am a professor of family and parenting research, and for a long time now, I've been the director of a research centre based here at the University of Kent called the Centre for Parenting Culture Studies.
Thank you. Full disclosure, I'm a visiting research fellow at the Center for Parenting Culture Studies, and it's been a real pleasure to work with you. But I think when most people hear about being an expert in parenting or in the study of parenting, they think that you are going to give advice about how to be a parent. How is that? How does that different from what you do in your research?
Yeah, it's a good point, because whenever I do any discussions, media discussions or what have you, that's what people think I am. They want to think I'm a parenting expert, which I'm not. I'm a sociologist by training, and the word culture in the title of our research centre, Parenting Culture Studies, is very important because it's parenting cultures that we're interested in. So both words there are important ones, parenting and culture. The culture bits. So I know that cultural studies or any kind of university research that has culture in it has, for understandable reasons, become something of a cause of jokes, as if it's not really something serious academically. And there is a whole separate thing that could be discussed there about the problems of various aspects of cultural studies and what it's become associated with. But for our purposes, the reason for having culture in the title is really to try and link what we've been doing through our research and our writing and what we're trying to draw attention to, on the one hand, a wider history of academic effort, which I think has actually been worthwhile in relation to trying to understand the workings of society, which is to do with a prior history in what used to be called family studies. And family studies isn't about giving parents advice about how to bring up their children. It's an effort to try and understand the family as an institution and its relationships to the wider society and what it constitutes. I think there can be a component to it that's kind of normative or evaluative. It doesn't have to be necessarily value neutral, and that might be something that we want to discuss about what's happened to some discussions of the family, which I think have become marked by a very extreme form of relativism. So we can talk about that. But I suppose if on that part of it, the person I think who has come up with perhaps one of the most useful formulations is somebody called Stephanie Kuntz, who wrote a terrific book called The Social Origins of Private Life. And what she's trying to point to there is that a very important thing to do if you're trying to understand the workings of societies is to understand the ways in which what emerges as what we call public domains of life and what we might understand as private domains, where the boundaries are, how they interact, and why they're formed the way that they are. And what she says in the beginnings of this book that she wrote about it is that she sees the family as a culture's way of coordinating personal reproduction within social reproduction. And I think that's a good way of thinking about how we might think about the family and society, which of course does mean that you recognise that in different societies and at different times, the family appears differently and people experience it differently. So one of the things about the point about making culture part of this is really to kind of understand the generation of the social norms and mores and ways of thinking about personal reproduction. and what influences us and how we think about that within the wider context of social reproduction. If we understand that's what the family is doing, and we can see the family in that sense as a cultural accomplishment, and we can have a discussion about its history and the different ways it operates in different forms of society and at different times. And as I say, I think that we can consider some ways of doing this as being better or worse. The reason why I'm making that point, and we might want to go on to discuss this, and I know that you've written and thought about this quite a lot, I think that some people have taken that observation and run with it in a way that they make the family appear as if it's just this very flimsy social construction that can be deconstructed. And some people say that they want to do that. They want to go to a war against the family and destroy the family and reconstruct it. Which I think completely misunderstands the rootedness of particular forms of family within wider societies and what can matter about that. So that's one side of it in terms of the culture part. The reason why it's called parenting culture studies, and this was really our starting point when we set up the research centre here, is just to recognise that since most people would say since somewhere in the 1970s, and as any historian will tell you, you can always find histories upon histories. So it would be wrong to say that this just starts on a particular date in the 1970s. But fairly recently, there has been a turn towards the development of a particular set of cultural forms which are concretized in various different ways, which have developed what our colleague Nancy McDermott calls a historically and socially specific form of family life. And I think that that's the way I suppose I would think about parenting culture, is that it's a particular form of family life which has within it the upfronting of this idea of parenting, and that what needs to happen and what has to happen within a family is this thing we call parenting. And I think that the observation is that parenting isn't the same as what has happened previously at other points in history. It isn't what we have to be doing. And it's got a lot of problems with it. So it's the emergence of a particular set of norms, or I suppose you might even say anti-norms, which constitutes parenting. I mean, the term has a particular focus on the parent-child relationship, and in turn, a particular sort of focus on that relationship. And that becomes the locus for what's communicated to us about what we're supposed to be doing as parents. So that was kind of, our starting point in setting up the centre and wanting to have a discussion about this was actually quite simple. It was just to try and do a proper investigation of that word and what we mean by that word and why it's now become the term that it is and what it constitutes. And over the time we've been working on this and running the centre, it's moved very considerably. When we began, it was something that was really mostly used by professionals and in professional circles. It's certainly very associated in its origins with psychology. So I think that you can see the rise of parenting as being a component part of a very thoroughgoing psychologization of private life and personal relationships. And that's wider than parents and children, but that can be discussed. But over time, it's kind of spread and widened, and I think has become actually part of much more of subjectivity of how parents think about what they're doing with their children. So people say, I'm doing parenting, which is a different thing. And I think it's got a lot bound up with it in terms of what that suggests to us about what the family is. I think there's a deinstitutionalization of the family. You could think about it that way.
What do you mean by that?
Well, what I mean is that I think that where people start when they think about how we might think about reproducing ourselves in the society, what's going on there and what that constitutes is that it's become formulated around an increasing idea of psychological relationships between parents and their children, which is a different thing to seeing the family as one of society's institutions, which is guided by wider norms and ideas and precepts, which come from somewhere else in society. So I think that parenting has less of a kind of moral component to it than other ideas which have influenced what people have thought about. You know, if you think about what am I supposed to be doing when I'm a parent, what does it mean to be a parent? What is a parent? What are parents as a subset of adults? What are their responsibilities? I think the formulation of that as parenting, what I have to do is good parenting, has got particular connotations, which have become increasingly psychologized. And I think that does explain quite a lot of the difficulties and problems that exist then experientially, but also within, I think now, a fairly widely recognized problem of growing up. That, you know, when we try and when children grow up within a family situation and within the wider society, obviously that process of socialization is influenced by the cultural norms which are in the minds of the adults who are responsible for driving the growing up process. And I think that when what's in the minds of adults becomes increasingly dominated by psychological frames of references rather than other ones, it creates a different kind of growing up process, which we're now seeing some of the results of, many of which I find quite troubling.
So there's a lot to kind of dive into there. The the thing that I suppose would be good to kind of break down to begin with is this idea of the family as an institution, a site of social reproduction, because this has been really problematized. So if the family is the place where our norms and values are reproduced, and you are in a position where you think, well, those norms and values are really bad, they should be changed, then your attention is going to be drawn to the family as quite a bad institution. This is really where all the trouble starts. And then, of course, if you take it to an extreme, you have the sort of abolish the family advocate. What do you think is wrong with that outlook? Why is that the wrong place to look? Or is it the wrong place to look?
If we want to change the society as a whole, well, I do think it's the wrong place to look, because I think that you overburden the family with things it can't possibly address. So it's one, and you know, I think it's one of the things that's interesting about the kind of pseudo idea of being countercultural or revolutionary, which family abolitionists have in their mind, is that actually, in a certain sense, they're drawing off exactly the same song sheets as policymakers and those who run the society, who also have come to increasingly look to private sphere and personal relationships as the place you start if you want to do something about the society as a whole. So the politicization of family life and relationships between parents and children, radicals might think they're doing something radical. They're not doing anything radical at all. I mean, you know, it's governments who for a long time, and I think very markedly in Britain, have adopted that project. You know, they've gone out to politicize and to make relationships between families, between parents and children, into a political question. I mean, that was the one of the things when we started out the centre where you could see most obviously the rise of parenting was actually in the policy sphere. So in that sense, family abolitionists are just going along with a highly established government project. I don't think there's anything radical about it at all. And I think that the most obvious problem with doing this is that actually it's just not true, because the wider problems that there are to do with how we create a better future in the society more generally, I don't think it's right to start with the family. And it was one of the things that was written about extensively, not just by us, I mean, by other people as well, when people started critiquing the rise of parenting, and particularly the rise of the politics of parenting. It was to note the completely wrong casting of the origins of a really bewildering array of social ills and social problems, saying that they all begin in the family. They all begin with the parent-child relationship. They actually all begin in the womb. I mean, this was Tony Blair's pre-crime point. I mean, way back in the late 90s, in the beginning of the century, his idea that, you'd have fetal asbos. I don't know if you remember that discussion a long time ago now. Yeah, that you could already tell if you wanted to do something about crime, you already knew, and what you needed to do was something about the people that would breed the new criminals. And, it was remarked upon a bit at the time, but, that idea that you can derive the origins of all of the large social problems that, sociologists and others have tried to understand for a very long time, that if you want to understand the origins of them, you understand the origins of them in the beginnings of the life of a person. And obviously that opens a fairly large discussion about what we call this tendency in politics to see things that way. And I think that in their own way, these so-called radicals are seeing things the same way. I mean, they might think the social problems they want to address are different ones, but they're kind of desiccating the society as a whole into this beginning point, which I just think is wrong. I don't think that it is where problems of economic stagnation or whatever, social mobility, I don't think that these do begin there.
It's amazing that a lot of these people at the extreme end see themselves as following in a kind of communist tradition, and they'll quote the Communist Manifesto endlessly. And yet they will completely disregard the entire economic analysis that animates that whole point of view, which is to say that you can't blame human behavior and stupidity and greed and so on for the problems of capitalism, but that they are embedded in the system, that even if you act rationally, you will still have the same problems. So Marx presupposes the same rational subject as the classical economist. He doesn't need to bring in stupid people who raise their children improperly. It's the system itself. And that seems to be kind of forgotten in this search for perhaps this kind of exhaustion of that project, and a search and an exhaustion of the project that saw the working class as the political subject. That seems not to have worked out. So there's just well, maybe we have to create new subjects or something like that. But you mentioned Tony Blair. Can you give a few more examples of this kind of outlook and what it looks like in terms of policy, this outlook of blaming parents for social problems?
Yeah, well, so just to say, and we can talk about this more, the extent to which it's explicit parent blaming, and that's what you see in policy documents, is a mixed bag. So the vernacular and the way in which there is a articulation of the idea that there's a parental deficit isn't, I would say, normally presented explicitly by saying parents are useless idiots and it would be better if somebody else was raising their children. The vernacular is normally around how difficult it is, how stressful it is. Generically speaking, the term support is probably the one that's used most frequently over time. I think what has shifted though, so where this begins, where you can see it most clearly is with New Labour. So in this country, and I mean, it's now happening all over the place, and there's a lot of academic research about the different forms this takes in different European countries and within EU policy making. You've written about that, but also within individual countries' policy making, the way the turn to parenting formulates itself. But I would say that Britain was a world leader in this, and the new Labour government was a world leader in this, and it did quite explicitly and quite deliberately make the argument quite early on. I mean, from beginning from the 1970s. So one of the first documents published, Corp Supporting Families, which was from memory, I think 1998. But then there was a kind of slew of. Then there was one called Supporting Parents, that kind of followed on from this, and within those documents, you do find an increasingly explicit argument, although it's a bit defensive to begin with, that says that there's a problem with the history of the way policymakers have thought about the family, which is that they've been scared of intervening in it, and that fear needs to go. And that actually it is the responsibility and obligation of government to do something about families. And often the way politicians would then pose this is by talking about how hard they find being a parent, legitimize the idea that we're not just talking about other people, we're talking about us as well, everybody. There isn't anybody that can't do with parenting support from government. But underpinning it all was a very clear idea that policymakers believed that there is an evidence base through which you can link what parents do to problems of social mobility, and ultimately welfare state payments, larger economic questions, criminality, all of these things. So it's always been described as an evidence-based approach. This is evidence-based policy. In the documents, that's the kind of vernacular, we now know for sure, we know that parents are the most important thing, and therefore what we need to do something about more than anything is parents. So I think what's happened in this country, at least over that period of time, is the establishing, quite self-consciously, of a reformulation of the relationship between the sphere of policy making and the sphere of family life, which is then attains new components to it in terms of what the evidence base is considered to be, or what the particular focus should be. One of the things that we've done most work on within that as a research centre is the rise of what my colleague Jan McVarish ended up calling neuroparenting. So the claim underpinning a lot of it, and this is really from the beginning of this century and then has just maintained itself, and it's one of the ideas which has become, I think, very globalised, is that where we can understand the basis for the necessity for reshaping parental relationships and, telling parents more and more what to do and focusing more and more on the relationship between parents and their children, is to do with brain development in the early years, which begins at conception or even before conception, preconception. So it's variously called 0 to 5, 0 to 3, 1001 days. And the idea that there's a criticality to this early part of life, out of which springs everything else which may be good or bad in the wider society. And I think that's become a very, very strong belief within policy making, but more widely. And there's a lot to debate there in its own terms about what's gone on. And the way that then, it influences all sorts of things about how education's thought about, what matters about which bit of schooling, as well as the way that then influences, of course, the experience of parents themselves. So I think that's where, in this country at least, that's one place where you can see the rise of parenting very clearly, because it's discussed in those terms. Those are the words that are used, and that's what's said about it. Although it's certainly not the whole story, because there's a lot that's drawing on, which is coming from other sources as well.
What I often hear back when I kind of explain this is people say, well, science now tells us that this is the right way to raise children. And why shouldn't we just impart this information that science says is correct? And what is wrong with the science here? Is it surely, like, this is quite high level science? We're talking, neuroscience. Surely us lowly sociologists should stay in our lane. What do you think of that kind of criticism?
Well, I think that what's happened is that terminology that means something within neuroscience, and which is undoubtedly generating, important observations and things that we might want to think about, becomes used almost sort of metaphorically, very widened, very broadened. It becomes, there's a fluidity to it which departs from what you would expect from a scientific understanding. So one book I would highly recommend, if anybody's interested in looking at this more, which tracks the origins of all of this in America. It's a book by somebody called John Brewer called The Myth of the First 3 Years. And what he's doing in that book is looking at this problem of the interplay between observations emerging from neuroscience and the way they're then adopted by other components in society, which includes lobby groups, professionals, charitable organizations, people who want to lobby for money and resources for things that they're doing. And it may, it's not that they're not necessarily well-meaning people. They want to get more money for setting up services for childcare or, little children, whatever. But there is a presentation of scientific concepts which departs very considerably from the science. So one example he discusses in that book is the idea of a critical period, which in neuroscience I'm not a neuroscientist, but I do understand it means something quite specific within the development of the relationship between the brain and certain capacities. So there are critical periods in development, but they're very specific. The way that then appears in discussions of the early years is that the early years is the critical period. It's, and this is the thing that's then said is that, the period of life from 0 to 3, or from 0 to 5 or whatever is we know it is the most important in the whole of life. And what you then get is a kind of use it or lose it idea of what you've got to do then if you're going to produce a functioning member of society. And if you mess it up, you won't. And if you do it right, you might. And that you can brain build, you can increase capacity, but you can also completely mess it up if you don't do the right things all of the time. And that isn't science. That's something else. It's very overblown, overheated. And I think, as anybody would say, scientific observations of things that come out of empirical observation and what have you are generally necessarily quite partial, incremental in their development, and don't necessarily make themselves susceptible then to generalized messages about what all parents should do. That wouldn't be a thing that you would expect to come out of scientific observation. So I think that whole relationship between science and then the claims about science is a very, very problematic one. And that's true about, lots of things about that relationship as they now exist in our world. I wish some of the people involved in the scientific domain would say more about that and try and defend their own sphere of expertise and what it can do and what it can't do more completely. and set their face more strongly against the politicization of science, because I think that's created lots of problems for science itself, never mind for what goes on with families and how parents might think about what they're doing. So, I mean, obviously you would be a complete idiot to say that brains don't matter, like hearts don't matter, or, whatever. I mean, obviously we're biological beings. The interaction between the brain, the mind, and the society is a very important one. And we do, there's nothing wrong with recognizing that and thinking about it. And obviously we want to care for little children as well as we can. But I think what's around now in the articulation of it has gone a long, long way past, what you might say of, just parents caring for their children in a responsible way. Because it's become attached to an idea that if you do these things, you can solve these problems in the society, or you can make them worse. And I don't think those are reasonable things to load onto an idea of just looking after your kids in a perfectly acceptable way.
I would also, oh yeah, sorry.
Well,
I would,
the baby's brain has become almost like the route to the resolution of social problems, whichever social problem somebody thinks that it is the one that they want to resolve.
I would just also direct listeners to my interview with Gabriel Scheidecker, who also talks about the problems with the so-called science when you take it into a global context. It sort of breaks down, because another issue is that most of the studies of parenting are done on, largely white middle class people. And that's been the case since about the 1960s. And it would be quite amazing if American parents had just figured it out completely and totally over, millennia of child rearing. No, this is really the ultimate, the pinnacle of how to raise children. And of course, there's this blind spot for things like class and so on. But that it produces these crazy ideas like that, extraordinary percentages. I think I'm going to butcher the statistics, but something like 95% of the children in Chad are abused and all of this sort of thing, because they have these ridiculous understandings of what constitutes abuse and poor parenting.
Well, I agree with you that anybody who's interested in this would really do well to have a look at his work, and what's being investigated and understood there about what emerges in the globalization of this precept, which, as I say, has its origins in America in the decade of the brain, way back a long time ago, but has expanded and expanded. And I think that, I read his work and I am completely horrified about what's happened in our world, about the fact that, major, incredibly powerful global institutions, the IMF, the World Bank, are now explicitly arguing that the problems of global economics and underdevelopment in countries in the world can be understood as a byproduct of parents not understanding brain-based parenting. Which, if you want to understand the complete horror of this line of thinking, that you end up explaining the global economic order with reference to what poor, as in economically deprived people in some parts of the world, how they're interacting with their children, that's how you then explain global economics. You can see the mess of it all, and it's really terrible. And I do also think, coming back to this question of what on earth is going on with radicals, to not be able to understand that this is a form of domination over people in less developed parts of the world by very powerful forces, which takes away from them in a really important way, to not want to rail against that, and to, if you want to do something about colonization and be decolonial, or say something, to not want to defend the ability of and the right of people in other parts of the world to have a form of family life and a way of looking after their children that is theirs and is part of what they're doing in the culture, and instead to endorse an idea of the overtaking of this by incredibly powerful global institutions.
Visit patreon.com/Ashley A. Frawley for part 2.